Good afternoon. For my grandkids and anybody else who's interested in listening, I'm going to start today reading my mother's book, A Day of Rest. This hat was actually made by one of my Kentucky relatives, and this is the kind of hat that they wore to protect themselves from the sun when my mother was a little girl. Chapter 1, Sunday, A Day of Rest. Douglas McTay yawned, then pulled open the screen door leading from the kitchen to the back porch. As he walked along the porch that covered the entire back of the house, he could still hear his 5-year-old daughter Susan in the kitchen arguing. "I won't wear the bonnet," Susan was saying. "You won't go to the singing convention then," Aunt Mary replied firmly. At the end of the porch, Douglas stood for a moment, staring at the vegetable garden on the other side of the fence that ran along the back side of the house. He was not thinking about the garden, but about Susan and the bonnet. He shook his head doubtfully before stepping down off the porch and heading for the hammock under the white oak in the front yard. Susan had her dad's sympathy. He hated to get dressed up in new clothes. You really couldn't enjoy yourself if you had to be concerned about your clothes. Douglas looked down at the gray work pants that he was wearing with satisfaction. The pants were clean, but he didn't have to worry about getting them dirty. Susan would have to worry about that new dress since Aunt Mary demanded that Susan keep her good clothes clean. It would have been all right for Susan to wear a clean older dress that afternoon. Most of the children at the singing convention would be wearing old clothes. Susan's brother Bert, waiting for Susan at the bottom of the drive, was wearing old pants and no shoes at all. But Douglas knew he shouldn't interfere with Aunt Mary's discipline. Aunt Mary was a little woman, nearly 80, but she would win the argument, Doug was sure. Susan might as well reconcile herself to wearing the sunbonnet to the school or plan to stay home. Doug closed his eyes as he lay down on the hammock. He would get a little nap before getting up to scratch out the new potatoes that Aunt Mary wanted for supper. When the screen door opening on the front porch slammed, Doug opened one eye and nodded as he watched Susan in her new dress and new bonnet and new shoes walk down the driveway to where Bert was waiting. As Susan came to the end of the driveway, Bert turned and began walking along the top of the bank that was parallel to the highway. But Susan stopped and looked back at the house she had just left. The hot summer sun shining down from an unclouded sky cast a shadow over the porch of the frame house. Contrasted with the sunlight reflected from the white siding of the house, the porch extending across the front was in deep shadow. Susan stared through the brilliant afternoon sunlight at the porch to see if there was a darker shape of a man or woman in that shadow. There was no one on the swing. However, Aunt Mary could still be watching from inside the house. Susan studied the windows carefully to catch any movement. No, there wasn't even a shadow behind the white gauze panel. The curtains hung full and straight. No one could be there. For a minute, Susan looked thoughtfully at the garage. No sound came from there. She did not see anyone anywhere, anyone that might be watching. Susan did not think to look at the hammock beneath the white oak where her dad was lying watching her. What is Susan up to? Doug asked himself as she turned to walk along the path at the top of the bank. Susan walked slowly until she came to a large sassafras bush growing along the fence bordering Zach Morgan's potato field. When the bush hid her from the house, she began untying the strings of her bonnet. After removing the bonnet, she carefully spread out her dress so that it wouldn't be wrinkled or soiled before she sat down on the short grass and pulled off her shoes and her stockings. Susan stuck the stockings into the shoes and made a tight roll of the bonnet before pushing both bonnet and shoes behind a clump of tall sage grass growing between the sassafras bush and the wire fence. What can Susan be doing? Douglas asked himself again as he watched Susan sit down behind the bush. She wasn't in any kind of trouble because he could see Bert walking along, whipping the weeds of each side of the path with a stick he had picked up. Bert would be at Susan's side in a minute if she were in trouble. Doug couldn't think of any kind of trouble she could get into just walking along the top of the bank, even though this would be the first time she had gone anywhere without either Aunt Mary or himself along to take care of her. Wiggling her toes in enjoyment at their freedom, Susan leaned back on her hands, letting the soft, gentle breeze dry the tendrils of hair curling around her face. The breeze picked up the sweet fragrance of the honeysuckle vine that covered the wire fence. The blossoms in the afternoon sun had lost the white crispness of the early morning, when the cool air had settled the dew into sparkling drops on the waxy blossoms. The tiny trumpets were now a soft, mellow yellow, with their scent muted to a vanilla whisper. Stretching forward to pick one of the small golden trumpets, Susan jerked back in fright as a beating, throbbing shape cut between her and the vine. Susan held her breath, all her movements frozen. Then slowly, softly, she released her breath. A ruby-throated hummingbird quivered in front of a creamy flower, the long, slender beak thrust deep into a yellow tube for nectar. The emerald green head and the back glistened brilliantly in the sunlight. The wings only a gray blur of motion that stopped for a moment as the tiny bird rested on the top wire of the fence and cocked its head to get a better view of the brown-haired girl looking at him. "Don't be afraid," Susan whispered softly. Satisfied that there was no immediate danger, the tiny bird flitted to a flower right in front of Susan. Finding no nectar in the yellow flower, it darted to another flower, only a few inches beyond. There was no nectar in that one either, so it flitted to another flower and then to another. Then, with a sudden whir of wings, the small bird was gone. "Come back," yelled Susan. "I won't hurt you." Why had the bird flown away? Susan wondered. Did the little bird not like the yellow flowers? All the flowers were yellow on the vine that drooped down the side of the fence that faced the sun. However, there might still be white flowers on the shady side. Jumping to her feet, Susan walked forward until she came to the wooden post that held up the fence. She grabbed the post and pulled herself upward so that she might see the other side to check if there were white flowers there. So that was what it was. Douglas laughed as he saw Susan's bare head come up over the fence. She's probably pulled her shoes off too. He wondered idly whether he ought to go down there and get the bonnet. Yes, Doug told himself as he closed his eyes, I'd better go get them. 10-year-old Bert, walking along the top of the bank beside the tar surface road, felt his responsibility in taking care of his sister, but he didn't want to let her know it. Leaning over to kick the fluff of seeds from a dandelion, he was able to conceal his backward glance to see what Susan was doing. "Susan, come on. You're not supposed to be climbing fences in that new dress," Bert yelled at his sister. "I thought you wanted to go to the singing convention." Bert waited impatiently for his sister. Under straight black eyebrows drawn together in a heavy frown, Bert's hazel eyes looked stern with the assumed dignity of command. The dignity of the eyes and brows were in striking contrast to the large freckles that splashed across his nose and cheeks. The freckles matched the auburn hair. The hair, with red highlights in the bright sunshine, had been slicked down with water just before Bert left home, but now the hair was drying. Wiry red points stuck straight up at the crown of his head, while dark red streaks tumbled down his forehead, almost touching the black eyebrows. Bert felt the dignity of his 10 years when asked to take the responsibility of his sister, but not to the point that he would wear his school clothes. A faded blue shirt and overalls that showed worn patches at knees and seat, together with his bare feet, were for comfort, not dignity. "Susan, I'm waiting," Bert commanded in as gruff a voice as he could manage. But Susan wasn't to be hurried. She had to remember where she had placed her bonnet and shoes. She looked carefully around at the bush, at the fence, and then across the road at an old chimney which was all that remained of the weaver's home that burned several years before. Then she said it to herself so that she would be sure to remember. "The shoes and bonnet are behind the first sassafras bush from the corner of the fence, and that bush is just across the road from the old chimney." The blue ribbons on the brown braids of hair hanging down Susan's back swung back and forth, pounding her back to the same rhythm as the slap of the skirt of her newly starched dress on her legs as she ran after her brother. The rhythm of the braids was the same rhythm as the beat of her bare feet pounding along the top of the bank in front of Zach Morgan's home. Susan's face, with the sprinkling of tiny freckles on the turned-up nose, glowed with excitement. Her blue eyes sparkled with the enjoyment of living. She was going to the singing convention. Susan changed the rhythm of her pounding feet from the fast, determined run to a slow, happy skipping. To that rhythm, she sang, "Here we go round the mulberry bush, the mulberry bush, the mulberry bush." The song seemed to fit the occasion to Susan, since there were now blackberry briars growing in clusters along the edge of Zach Morgan's pasture. Susan knew the blackberries were not mulberries, but the patches of briars were big enough to be bushes. Sometimes the briars even stretched out to cover the top of the bank. Then Susan had to stop skipping and edge carefully along the path. A careless swish of the skirt of her new apple print dress, followed immediately by a long, ripping, tearing sound, which brought Susan to a complete halt. The skirt of her new dress, destined to be worn to school in the fall, was caught in a briar. The dress had just been completed Thursday. Aunt Mary would be furious if it were torn. One of Aunt Mary's last commands had been for Susan to take care of that new dress. Cautiously, Susan edged closer to the briars and began easing out the thorns. No real damage had been done. The holes were just pools that would close back together when the dress was washed. Susan McTay, come on this minute," Bert ordered in his big brother tone. "You are 5 now and should be able to walk along the road without stopping." The fact that her 10-year-old brother was quoting Aunt Mary exactly didn't prevent Susan from being angry. She had to stop to get her new dress off the briars so it wouldn't be ripped, and she was almost 6. Angry words came to her lips, but she held them back. She didn't want to get Bert angry. Bert had wanted to go fishing that afternoon down on Willow Creek with Uncle Charles' youngest boy, Jas. Since Jas was 14 and most of the time went fishing with his older brothers, Bert had felt honored that he had been asked. And to not get to go fishing just because he had to take his sister down to his old schoolhouse to hear a lot of singing was enough to make anybody angry. I wanted to show you the picture that was in the front of this chapter. There's a picture of the dad, Mr. McTay, in the hammock under the tree. Next time I'll read you chapter 2.